It's not responding. A single voice, a single sentence, caught on a control room recording. That was never supposed to be heard. They had 47 seconds to stop it. They used those 47 seconds to argue. A coffee cup trembling on a steel desk. A warning light pulsing in a silent room. An engineer's hand frozen above a kill switch he was too afraid to press. A phone ringing and ringing and ringing. By the time the senior engineer admitted he was wrong, the failure had already cascaded through 4 separate systems. He never apologized. He was promoted 6 months later. This is not a story about a machine breaking. Machines break every day. This is a story about a man who believed, genuinely believed, that he could not be wrong. And the 14 people who paid for that belief. We have the memos. We have the emails. We have the names they tried to bury under legal threats and non-disclosure agreements. The final death toll is on your screen right now. But forget that number for a moment, because before we get to the bodies, you need to understand the room where the decision was made, and the man who refused to listen before the disaster. They were untouchable. Ribbon cuttings, magazine covers, industry awards stacked so high they needed a second display case. The institution at the center of this story wasn't some shadowy outfit operating in the dark. It was celebrated, funded, protected, held up as proof that ambition and engineering could rewrite what was possible. And the man at the top? Every single person we interviewed described him with the exact same word: untouchable. Not brilliant, not visionary, not respected, untouchable. 18 months before the disaster, a junior employee noticed something wrong. The numbers didn't add up. The readings drifted in a pattern that shouldn't have existed. So they did what they were trained to do. They filed a report. They followed protocol. They trusted the system to do its job. The report was reviewed. The report was stamped. And then the report was buried. Reviewed. No action required. 7 words. 7 words that sealed the fate of 14 people who had no idea their lives were already on a timer. That whistleblower is still alive. We spoke to them. Their voice had to be modulated, their location hidden. Because even now, years after the bodies were counted, the people who buried that report are still in power. To understand how 47 seconds destroyed everything, we have to go back. Back to a decision made in a boardroom no one was supposed to know existed. Back to a man who eliminated every safety net in his path and called it progress. This is the story of how arrogance became architecture, how a warning became a whisper, and how 47 seconds became a grave. Before he became the man who killed 14 people, he was a god. They called him a prodigy, an outsider, the boy who out-engineered men twice his age and never let them forget it. By 32, he had patents. By 40, he had a magazine cover. By 45, he had something far more dangerous. He had certainty. Watch this clip closely. It's from a televised industry panel, 2017. The room is laughing. He isn't smiling. Redundancy, he tells them, is for people who don't trust their own math. The audience claps. 2 engineers in the back row do not. That single sentence, that one philosophy, would become the blueprint for everything that came next, including the bodies. When he took control of the operation, the first thing he did wasn't to build, it was to dismantle. He called the internal peer review process decision by committee paralysis. Within 90 days, he had dissolved it entirely. 2 safety committees, gone. An independent risk board, gone. The org chart shrank from a web of oversight to a single name at the top. His. And the people who stayed? They learned the rules quickly. You did not disagree with the architect in public. You did not disagree with the architect in private. You did not disagree with the architect at all. 3 names you need to remember, because each one of them saw it coming. The deputy, brilliant, loyal, privately terrified. He kept a personal journal during this period. Investigators would later find 17 entries using the word catastrophe. The regulator, a government inspector with 26 years of experience, he filed 3 formal objections. He was reassigned to a different region within a month, and the investor, the man who never appeared in public, but whose phone calls rewrote budgets overnight. He pushed for the cost cuts that made the flaw not just possible, but inevitable. Then came 2019, and the first scream from the data itself. An internal stress test produced results that were wrong, not slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong, the kind of numbers that should have stopped everything. So the architect did what he always did. He didn't fix the system. He rewrote the test. He personally adjusted the parameters again and again until the numbers finally agreed with him. We obtained both versions, the original report and the corrected one. Side by side, they tell you everything you need to know about what kind of man was in charge. A former colleague, face hidden, voice altered, said it best on camera. He didn't lie. That's what people get wrong about him. He genuinely believed that the universe would bend before he did. And for a while, it seemed like it would. To understand what killed those people, you have to understand the flaw. Just one, not 1,000. Not a conspiracy of negligence. A single, fatal miscalculation buried in the bones of the system. It wasn't exotic. It wasn't unknowable. It was the kind of flaw a second-year engineering student could spot if anyone had been allowed to look. The design called for a tolerance, a margin, a breathing space between what the structure could handle and what it would actually be asked to endure every single day. That margin was erased, quietly, on paper, in a revision nobody flagged. The safety buffer that had existed for decades in every comparable system was simply gone. And here's the part that haunts the investigators to this day. The flaw was known. It was known in 2020. It was known in writing. An external consultant, hired, ironically, to rubber stamp the project, flagged it in a 14-page report. He used the word catastrophic 3 times. The report was filed. Then it disappeared. A subcontractor refused to sign off on the installation. He walked off the job. Within 72 hours, he was replaced. Within a week, his name was scrubbed from the project records. And then there was the email. A mid-level manager, a man whose name we still cannot say on camera, sat down at his desk one Tuesday morning and typed a subject line that would later be read aloud in a courtroom. 6 words. "We are going to kill someone." That email was deleted from the company server within 48 hours. It was only recovered because litigators subpoenaed the backup drives years later. Nobody replied to him. Nobody called him in. Nobody asked him to elaborate. The silence was the answer. So how did the system keep running? How did a structure with a known lethal flaw operate for years without collapsing on day 1? The answer is the most disturbing part of this entire story. They invented something called the workaround, a manual override procedure, officially temporary, officially a stopgap, officially under review. It was never temporary. It became the job. Operators were trained to execute it on every shift, every hour, sometimes every few minutes. And nobody, not one supervisor, ever told them what they were actually doing. They weren't running a system. They were compensating for a system that should never have been approved. They were holding the whole thing together with their own hands. One of them, a former operator, now living somewhere he asked us not to name, agreed to speak. His voice cracked twice during the interview. "We did it 400 times a day," he told us. 400, like brushing your teeth. Nobody told us we were holding the building up with our hands. And then, in the final 3 months, the workaround itself began to fail. Intermittently, quietly. A glitch here, a delay there, a reading that didn't match. Every single failure was logged, dutifully, in neat little entries, time-stamped and initialed. 47 separate incidents in 90 days. Not one of them was escalated. Not one phone call. Not one emergency meeting. The logs sat there went like a countdown nobody bothered to read. The temporary fix had become the foundation. The foundation was decaying. And somewhere, a clock the architect couldn't see was running down to 47 seconds. The warnings came in waves. Not whispers, not vague concerns. Concrete, specific, terrifyingly accurate predictions of exactly what would happen. And every single one of them was filed away, stamped, forgotten, or simply erased. The first came from a structural analyst named in court documents only as Witness 4. She had been with the company for 11 years. She knew the math, and the math was screaming. In a 38-page report submitted 17 months before the incident, she modeled the workaround failure scenario down to the second. Her projection? Catastrophic cascade within 45 to 60 seconds of initial trigger. The actual disaster unfolded in 47. She was off by 2 seconds on a prediction made a year and a half early. Her reward for being right. She was transferred to a regional office, stripped of clearance, told her modeling assumptions were too pessimistic for internal distribution. Then came the letter, anonymous, hand-delivered, slipped under the door of a regulatory inspector at 6:14 in the morning, 3 months before the collapse. 3 pages, no signature, just a list of failure points and a single line at the bottom that read, "Please, before someone dies." The inspector forwarded it up the chain. The chain forwarded it sideways. By the time it reached someone with authority to act, it had been reclassified as uncorroborated employee grievance. And then there were the locals, the people who lived in the shadow of this thing. They had been complaining for years. The low hum at night, the vibrations that rattled glassware, the strange smell after heavy rain. They filed petitions. They held town meetings. One resident, a retired teacher named Margaret, kept a logbook. Every tremor, every odd sound, every time her dog refused to go outside. She mailed copies to the company, to the regulator, to her congressman. She received 3 form letters and 1 phone call from a public relations officer who told her, and I'm quoting from the recording she made, "Ma'am, you are not qualified to interpret what you are experiencing." Margaret was 71 years old. She had taught physics for 40 years. Inside the facility, the silence was louder. Engineers stopped raising concerns in writing. They started using a different word for the workaround. They called it the prayer. One technician later testified that on the morning shifts, the team had a ritual. They would tap the main console twice before initiating the override. Nobody remembered who started it. Nobody questioned it. The architect was made aware of the anonymous letter. He was made aware of Witness 4's report. He was made aware of all of it. His response, captured in a single internal email recovered during discovery, was 4 words long. Manage the noise downstream. Manage the noise downstream. That was the directive. Not fix the flaw. Not pause operations. Not even investigate. Just silence the people who were trying to save lives. And the noise was managed. Right up until the moment. The noise became a scream. By the spring of that final year, the warnings were no longer whispers. They were screams. Screams buried in inboxes. Screams locked inside filing cabinets. Screams no one in power wanted to hear. The first scream came from a woman named only as Witness C in the eventual court filings. A senior analyst, 15 years inside the institution. She had watched the workaround fail 3 times in a single week. She did what every training manual told her to do. She filed a formal incident report. She marked it urgent. She copied her supervisor's supervisor, and the compliance officer. 48 hours later, the report had vanished from the internal tracking system. Not archived, not closed. Vanished, as if it had never existed at all. When she asked where it went, she was told, And this is a direct quote from the deposition. "You're seeing patterns that aren't there. Take some time off." She took the time off. She never came back to the same job. By the end of the month, she had been quietly transferred to a satellite office 200 miles away. A promotion on paper, an exile in practice, and she was not alone. We've now identified at least 9 separate individuals who raised formal red flags in the final 18 months. 9 engineers, operators, 1 external auditor, even a junior intern, who wrote a single-page memo that turned out to be more accurate than any official risk assessment ever filed. Every single one of them was either reassigned, silenced, or simply ignored. But the most damning warning didn't come from inside the building. It came from a man the architect had personally hired 6 years earlier, a protege, a believer, someone who had once described his mentor as the closest thing engineering has to a prophet. His name appears in the final report only as Subject D. We know now that in the months before the incident, Subject D ran his own private simulations on his own laptop after hours off the books. What he found terrified him. The workaround wasn't just failing intermittently. According to his models, it was approaching a mathematical certainty of catastrophic collapse, not a possibility, not a risk, a certainty. Within months, he drove to the architect's home on a Sunday evening. He brought the printouts in a manila folder. He sat in the kitchen for 90 minutes and laid out every number, every projection, every scenario. The architect listened. He poured them both a drink. And then, according to Subject D's sworn testimony, he smiled and said 7 words. "You're confusing precision with prophecy, son." That was the end of the conversation. Subject D drove home. He did not file a report. He did not call a regulator. He did not warn anyone else. Because in that moment, he understood something the rest of us are only learning now. The institution wasn't going to listen. The institution couldn't listen. To admit the flaw existed would be to admit that the architect was wrong. And the entire structure of the company, the share price, the contracts, the reputations of every executive in the building, was built on the belief that he never was. So the warnings kept coming, and the warnings kept dying, filed, buried, reassigned, forgotten. 43 documented red flags in the final year alone. We've confirmed the number through 3 independent sources, 43 chances to stop it. 43 moments where one person in one room could have picked up one phone and saved 14 lives. None of them did. And in 72 hours, the system everyone had been quietly screaming about would finally start to scream back. The morning of the incident began like any other. Coffee cups on desks, the hum of fluorescent lights, the soft chatter of a control room shift change. Nobody knew that within hours, 14 people would be dead. At 6:42 a.m., the first anomaly appeared on console 4. A pressure reading, drifting slightly outside tolerance. The operator on duty had seen it 100 times before. He logged it. He moved on, but this time was different. This time, the workaround, the manual override that had kept the system breathing for nearly 2 years, was beginning to fail in a way nobody had been trained to recognize. At 7:15 a.m., a second console lit up, then a third. Within minutes, 4 separate subsystems were reporting irregularities. The supervisor on the floor called his shift lead. The shift lead called nobody. He would later testify under oath that he didn't want to embarrass himself by escalating a situation that might resolve on its own. Those were his exact words. Embarrass himself. Outside the facility, life moved on. Children boarded school buses. Delivery trucks rumbled past the perimeter fence. A woman walked her dog along the access road, unaware she was 300 meters from a system in active collapse. At 8:03 a.m., the architect arrived at his office. He was briefed on the readings within 4 minutes of walking through the door. His response? was recorded on the building's internal communication. Tell them to run the standard procedure and tell them to stop calling me about it. The deputy, the one who had privately disagreed for years, was in that room. He said nothing. He did nothing. He would later tell investigators that he was waiting for someone else to speak first. By 9 a.m., the workaround had failed completely. Operators were now performing manual interventions every 90 seconds just to keep the readings inside the safe band. They were sweating. Their hands were shaking. One of them, a 34-year-old technician named in the final report only as Operator C, sent a text message to his wife at 9:47 a.m. It read, "Something is very wrong here. I love you." He never sent another message. At 10:22 a.m., a regional inspector arrived for a scheduled visit. Routine, pre-announced. He had been visiting the facility for 11 years. He noticed immediately that something was off. The body language, the silence, the way nobody would meet his eyes. He asked to see the override logs. He was told they were being updated. He asked again. He was told to come back after lunch. That inspector would survive the day because he chose, against protocol, to leave the building and call his supervisor from the parking lot. His supervisor told him to wait, to not make waves, to trust the operators. He was still on the phone when the alarms began. Inside, in a windowless room on the 3rd floor, the senior engineer finally picked up the receiver. The readout in front of him was no longer drifting. It was screaming. And the clock on the wall had just started counting down the 47 seconds. That would define the rest of their lives. The hearing room was cold, fluorescent, silent. 14 empty chairs had been placed at the front, one for each victim. Nobody sat in them. And at the back of that room, behind a polished oak table, sat the architect. He wore a charcoal suit. He carried no notes. He smiled at the cameras like a man arriving at a gala. The families had waited 11 months for this moment. 11 months of funerals, of unanswered emails, of watching him give keynote speeches while their children were being buried. The lead investigator opened with a single question. "Did you know about the workaround?" The architect leaned forward, and he said, "Define new." That phrase, those 2 words, became the entire shape of his defense. He didn't deny the flaw. He didn't deny the deaths. He denied the meaning of language itself. For 6 hours, he dismantled every document placed in front of him. The 2019 stress test, preliminary data, the deleted email, hyperbole by a junior employee, the whistleblower's report, filed through improper channels. Watch the footage closely, and you'll see something that haunts the investigators to this day. He never blinked, not once, not when the autopsy reports were read aloud, not when a mother showed him a photograph of her son. The deputy testified next. The man who had privately disagreed, who had publicly complied. He arrived with a lawyer on each side and an oxygen tube taped to his wrist. He was 61 years old. He looked 80, and under oath, he broke. He admitted he had seen the rewritten parameters. He admitted he had signed off knowing they were false. And then he said the sentence that ended his career in a single breath. "I was afraid of him. Everyone was afraid of him. We weren't running a company. We were running a court. And he was the king." The regulator was called on day 4. The man who had been outmaneuvered for nearly a decade. He brought a banker's box full of every warning he had ever filed. 47 warnings, 47 dismissals. He read each one into the record. It took 2 hours. Halfway through, a juror began to cry. The architect checked his watch, but then came the moment nobody had prepared for. The prosecution called the junior operator, the one who had performed the workaround 400 times a day, the one who believed she was doing her job. She testified that on the morning of the disaster, she had felt something was wrong, a vibration she didn't recognize. She had called her supervisor. He told her to keep going. She kept going. And then the floor moved. I held the override down with both hands, she said. I thought if I just held it tighter, it would stop. I thought it was my fault. For 11 months, I thought it was my fault. The architect's lawyer rose to cross-examine her. The judge, a woman who had said almost nothing for 4 days, looked down from the bench and said 6 words that ended that line of questioning forever. Counsel, sit down, right now. And in that silence, something shifted. The architect's smile finally cracked, just for a second, just enough for the cameras to catch it. Because he had spent 30 years building a fortress of certainty, and a 26-year-old operator with shaking hands had just walked through the front gate. The verdict was still weeks away, but everyone in that room already knew. The myth was over. What none of them knew, not the families, not the jurors, not even the architect himself, was that a second document had just surfaced. A document that would change everything. A document that proved he hadn't acted alone. So, we come back to it. The 47 seconds. The exact window where everything could have been stopped. We've walked through the arrogance, the buried memos, the workaround that became a coffin, the warnings, screamed into rooms where no one was listening. But the hardest truth, the one nobody in that building wanted to admit, is that the disaster didn't happen in 47 seconds. It happened over 18 years. The 47 seconds were just the moment the universe finally sent the invoice. The architect served 14 months. 14. 1 month for every life lost. He was released early for good behavior. Today, he gives paid lectures on leadership, on vision, on, and I am not making this up, the courage to ignore the noise. The deputy, the one who privately disagreed and publicly complied. He took his own life 8 months after the verdict. He left a note. 3 words. I knew, I knew, I knew. The regulator who was outmaneuvered now works as a consultant for the very industry he was supposed to police. His salary tripled, and the investor, the one who pushed for the cost cuts that opened the wound in the foundation, he was never named in any filing, never deposed, never questioned. His name does not appear in a single one of the 4,000 pages of the final report. The whistleblower, the junior employee from part 1, the one whose voice we modulated, the one who saw it 18 months before anyone died? She lives in another country now. Different name, different career. She told us in the final hour of our final interview, something I have not been able to stop thinking about. She said, "The worst part isn't that they didn't believe me. The worst part is that some of them did, and it still wasn't enough. Because that is the real machinery of a disaster like this. It isn't ignorance. It isn't even greed. Not really. It's the quiet, civilized agreement between people who know better to say nothing." The families of the 14 received settlements. The amounts are sealed. The non-disclosure agreements they signed are 47 pages long. One of them, a mother who lost her only son, refused to sign. She got nothing. She speaks anyway. The site of the disaster has been cleaned, rebuilt, rebranded. There is a small plaque near the entrance. You have to look for it. Most people walk past it every day without ever seeing the names. And the workaround, that temporary fix that became load-bearing infrastructure, a version of it, is still in use in other facilities, in other industries, under different names, right now, tonight. Because the lesson was never learned. The lesson was filed, reviewed, and stamped. No action required. So when you hear the next story, and there will be a next story, there is always a next story, remember this one. Remember the 47 seconds. Remember the man who believed the universe would bend before he did. Remember the 14 names on a plaque no one reads. And remember the junior employee who filed the report and was right all along. Because somewhere right now in a building you've never heard of, someone is filing that exact same report, and someone above them is reaching for the stamp. We'll see you past the point.